Vladimir Putin addressed all of Russia after attacks on Bryansk, Kursk, the bridges, Crimea, Kerch, the Kerch Bridge. How to hold such meetings in these conditions, like negotiations he's talking about. What do you talk about? Who even negotiates with those who bet on terror, with terrorists? And why encourage them? Providing respite in the fighting, which will be used to pump up the regime with Western weapons. This has been something that Russia's been saying from the very beginning. You know, a lot of people are saying, well, Russia should use an Oreshnik. Well, Russia should really step up the pace and accelerate escalation and be sure they send a huge message. What do you say about this?
Again, why is the U.S. Seeking negotiations? They only seek negotiations when they themselves need to either buy time or create the illusion of seeking diplomacy before they themselves escalate, or have one of their proxies escalate to create distance between themselves and their proxies. And as Ben has mentioned, the Trump administration is not sending nearly as many weapons to Ukraine as in the past. But this is something that I have been covering since 2022, since this conflict began. The U.S. has a finite amount of weapons and ammunition it can send to Ukraine, a finite amount that it can produce annually. It has a global spanning empire, essentially. It needs weapons to facilitate the other wars that it is fueling. Israel could not conduct military operations without a constant flow of U.S. weapons and ammunition. And of course, their military buildup in China. So they are out of weapons. This is something that I said would happen, that whatever they're making monthly from that, which is not a lot, a small percentage of that is still going to Ukraine, and it will continue. This is absolutely everything they have to send. So it's not President Trump is making a conscious decision not to further arm Ukraine. It's because they simply don't have the huge amounts of arms and ammunition to send Ukraine, which is why, again, Secretary Hegseth back in February told Europe, you need to expand production. You need to double down on sending weapons to Ukraine because we can't do it anymore. We need these weapons for China. We need these weapons for Iran and our attempt to reassert primacy over the Middle East. We have three areas that we're focusing on. We cannot do it all by ourselves, so we need our proxies to pitch in. So the other thing I want to point out is this concept of dual containment. Russia and China's awareness of this. A lot of people aren't really sure if they're aware of it or not. Obviously, they're aware of it. And this reflects both Secretary Hegseth's comments in February, where he talked about strategic sequencing and division of labor. And then just at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore late last month, he was there talking about, we dumped Ukraine off on Europe, and we're here in Asia. We were distracted for decades, burning down the rest of the world. But now we're ready to get busy here in Asia. And that is essentially what this is all about. It is about dual containment. It's about the U.S. delegating responsibility for this strategy amongst all of these nations that is politically captured and controls, both in Europe, but also here in the Asia-Pacific region. And that is what's actually driving what we see taking place. President Trump had no intention of ever ending the war. It's continuity of agenda. It's exactly where President Biden, who we all know is not making any decisions himself, that's where his administration left off. That's where he picked up. And this is a continuation of what's been going on since the turn of the 21st century. This is the post-Cold War strategy of eliminating all peer and near-peer adversaries or competitors, whatever the U.S. labels these nations as. Nobody is allowed have independent foreign policy. The planet is America's domain, and it is going to attempt to maintain that control over the planet. And that's where all of this is stemming from.
Ben, how is the United States going to be able to get to China per se? Because that's what Hegseth, that's what the Trump administration continues to actually communicate quite clearly, that they really are trying to dump Ukraine onto Europe, for example. They really are trying to move on. Now, West Asia and the Middle East is a bit complicated. There have been reports actually that they're moving more military hardware there supposedly away from Ukraine. And we know how bogged down the United States is allying with and funding Israel. But how is the United States going to, if there is this grand Eldridge Colby and these types, they have this grand strategy for moving toward a conflict with China. How do they do that if they're spread so thin everywhere, including Ukraine?
Well, this is why they've been trying since the Obama administration to have a pivot to Asia, right? This goes back to Obama's first term when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And in fact, this May, there were two speeches given by Trump administration officials that I think were very important that kind of outline this strategy. One was a speech given by J.D. Vance, the vice president, at the graduation ceremony of the U.S. Naval Academy. And then another speech was given by Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the summit that is held every year in Singapore, bringing together military officials and leaders largely from the Asia-Pacific region, although the U.S. always invites itself. And French President Macron was there, even though France is very far from the Pacific. But anyway, at this, I'll start with the Shangri-La Dialogue talk, because that was extremely hawkish. It was crazy. Hegseth said the U.S. is preparing for war. He repeatedly said that.
Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. The United States does not seek war. We do not seek to dominate or strangle China, to encircle or provoke. We do not seek regime change, nor will we instigate or disrespect a proud and historic culture. We will be ready, but we will not be reckless. Instead, we seek peace. But we must ensure that China cannot dominate us or our allies and partners. Maintaining the status quo requires strength. That's just a rational, common sense goal that we should all be able to live with. And together, we will achieve that peace through strength, reestablishing deterrence, sharing our burdens, multiplying our strengths, reinforcing our great alliances, respecting our cultures, not starting wars, but preventing them, and building a better future for our nations.
There he says quite clearly sharing burdens, and he quite and what he's been doing throughout the Trump administration is using peace and deterrence as almost dog whistles for war with China.
Yeah, well, you picked one of the more charitable parts of that speech where he claims that they don't want war and they want peace. I mean, every single empire in history has always claimed that it wants peace, and of course, they're not going to say openly they want war. They're going to say we're a force of stability and peace. But I mean, this is even what, Nazi Germany said. Oh, they had to intervene in Poland. They had to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to save Germans, all that. I mean, this is what every empire says, right? So the U.S. said they had to liberate Afghan women and whatever. So now they said they don't want war. But then you listen to the entire speech, and he makes it so clear they're preparing for war. In fact, at the end of the speech, he literally says, this is a quote, "We are preparing for war." That's an exact quote from the speech. And he says we were preparing for war for peace. I mean, it's just the whole Orwellian peace is war thing. So anyway, the point is in that speech, he makes a few important points. One, the U.S. is trying to pressure other countries in Asia to ally with the U.S. against China. He made that very clear. And this was given in Singapore. And I think a lot of it was targeted at the ASEAN countries and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But ASEAN, excluding the Philippines, every other country in the region has actually maintained a non-aligned foreign policy. And most countries still have very good relations with China. In fact, a poll was done last year that asked people in ASEAN if they were forced to pick a side, if they could only pick either China or the U.S., a slim majority said China for the first time. And a lot of that was because of the war in Gaza, right? I mean, U.S. support for Israel, and especially in Muslim majority countries in the region like Indonesia, which is the most populous country in the region, well over 200 million people. The vast majority of people in Indonesia said they prefer China. So this U.S. strategy of targeting ASEAN is not going to work, but that was part of the attempt of his speech. Another important part of his speech was saying that supposedly there will be a war over Taiwan. Now, and he made a few comments in that speech that were obviously supportive of secessionist forces and violate the spirit of the one China policy or the one China principle. When the US normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, it acknowledged the one China policy. There is one China and Taiwan is part of China. And yet he keeps making these comments saying China is going to invade Taiwan. It's like, is the US going to invade Florida? I mean, Taiwan is part of China. What does that mean? This is this propaganda we constantly hear again and again and again. So what it really means is that the US supports secessionism, and that the US has been, this is why the US has been giving billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwanese separatist forces, because they are preparing for a war with the mainland through Taiwan. And a lot of people have compared it to Ukraine, but it's very different at the same time, because Ukraine is not part of Russia. Taiwan is part of China. So this is an issue for China to deal with. This is China's internal affair. Why is the US telling the world to prepare for war over Taiwan? This is outrageous. And in Beijing, the people were really angry with this very heated speech, because basically he's saying that the US is preparing for war. Now, another part of that speech was also outrageous. He told countries in the region, he calls it the Indo-Pacific, which is part of this US attempt to rebrand the region. It's actually the Asia-Pacific, but only the US calls it Indo-Pacific because they're trying to also bring in India. And even India is not, I mean, they are a partner of the US, but India also has a non-aligned foreign policy. So India is complicated. But the point is that another part of the speech was that Pete Hegseth basically told countries in the region that they cannot have deep economic ties with China. He said, if you have security relations with the US, you cannot trade significantly with China, because he said if there's some kind of conflict, that will complicate our strategic decision making. So he went to Singapore to tell countries in the region, stop trading with China because we're preparing for war in China. I mean, it's just so crazy.
Why then would Russia, for example, settle for some kind of peace with Ukraine when it's backed by the United States, and the United States is behaving like this toward China? I mean, and of course, the examples can go on and on about the lack of trustworthiness of the other side. And yet what we've seen, I think, is both Russia and China operate in a very, a very diplomatic manner, maneuvering this. Your thoughts on what Ben said and this?
Yeah, Ben is absolutely right. I want to kind of dive a little deeper into Secretary Hegseth's speech. This Shangri-La dialogue is hosted by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. It's based in London, has nothing to do with Asia. And if you go to its website, look at who the top sponsors are: Airbus, BAE, Boeing, General Atomics, Rolls-Royce, which makes airplane engines, Lockheed Martin. If you scroll down, you'll see Northrop Grumman, BGR Group, Chevron, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all corporate financier interests from the West, the modern day manifestation of generations of Western imperialism and colonization here in the Asia-Pacific region. Imagine President Macron from France, who had colonized part of the region, coming here and talking about the West and Asia and maintaining the status quo. Secretary Hegseth also said this: the status quo. What is the status quo? It is Western hegemony over Asia, the West helping itself to this region at the expense of the people who actually live here. So that's one. Secretary Hegseth said the U.S. is not encircling or provoking China. And yet, if you listen to the whole speech, most of the speech is him bragging about how much military equipment, troops, and interoperability the U.S. is creating closer to Chinese shores than to U.S. shores. These are U.S. troops, tens of thousands of them, expanding their military footprint closer to China than they are to the United States. But he began the speech by saying, we need to secure our own backyard first. And he begins talking about the Panama Canal. And he claims that China had malign influence over the Panama Canal, which is 1,700 plus kilometers from the closest point in the continental United States. The Panama Canal doesn't belong to the U.S. It was transferred to Panama back in 1999. And so he's saying that is an unacceptable, that's unacceptable Chinese influence in America's backyard. And then he's describing this massive military buildup of the United States right along China's borders, much, much closer to China than the Panama Canal is to the United States. And one last thing, he said, he says the U.S. doesn't want war, and Ben touched on this. The U.S. doesn't want war, but the U.S. has been at constant war the entire 21st century. It's not been a day the U.S. has not been bombing somebody somewhere on planet Earth. And China, throughout the entire 21st century, has not waged war against anyone. Have not fired a single shot at another nation. And so and then at one point, he even admits that. He said, we were distracted for a generation in wars and regime change. And he's talking about the Middle East, of course, the ongoing proxy war the U.S. triggered in Ukraine. And now he's saying, now we're coming back to Asia. To do what? To do the exact same thing to Asia that the U.S. has done around the entire planet. He's talking about how prosperous and secure and stable Asia is, while admitting the U.S. has been distracted from the region for a generation. So why do you think there's all this peace, prosperity, and stability in Asia? Because the U.S. has not been involved as deeply here in Asia Pacific as it has around the rest of the world, which it is demonstrably burning to the ground. So what his message to the Asia Pacific region is, you're next. We're coming to Asia Pacific. We're going to hold peace, security, and stability hostage unless you do what we tell you. And I forget whether it was Danny or Ben, you talked about him forcing the region basically to make a choice. So you either pick security cooperation with us, which means turning yourself into the next Ukraine, or you can have economic cooperation with China. So they're always saying we're not forcing anyone to make a decision, but he literally used the word insist, and having difficult discussions, which means you need to do what we tell you. And this was his message to Asia. And unfortunately, many of the people in the audience, not all of them, but many people in the audience, and I know people here in Thailand where I'm based, where that message resonates, because they have this desperate, deep desire to be accepted by the West, and they just don't see the big picture. That's the unfortunate part of all of this.
There was a crazy moment at the Shangri-La Dialogue, this summit held in Singapore, although as Brian correctly pointed out, it's sponsored by this hawkish British think tank funded by Western corporations. But in this meeting, the defense minister of the Philippines was present. Teodoro is his last name. And he was interviewed by Chinese journalists, and he went off on them. He started yelling at these Chinese journalists, and he called them Chinese intelligence agents with no evidence whatsoever. These are journalists I know, by the way. They're just like these young journalists. They do good work. And he not only did he call them Chinese intelligence agents, but then the Philippine government created these crazy like meme propaganda posters with the faces of these Chinese journalists saying like warning Chinese intelligence agents, like military intelligence. It was juvenile. It was crazy seeing a government do this to these poor, like 20-something Chinese journalists who were just like so taken aback by it. And it went viral on Chinese social media, these clips of this Philippine defense minister yelling at them. And this is the only country in the region that is like volunteering to become the Ukraine of the Asia Pacific region. The U.S. the U.S. military is using 9 bases in the Philippines. The U.S. has installed a missile system in the northern part of the Philippines called the Dhaiphong missile system that has a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers. It can hit the vast majority of the cities in mainland China. And yet the U.S. says we want peace. Even though in the same speech, literally in the same speech, he said, quote, "We are preparing for war," end quote. But then he says we want peace. And also, by the way, I forgot to make one other quick point. In that speech, Hegseth claimed in the clip you showed, he said, "We do not want to encircle China." That is objectively false. That is a lie. I did a video about this and I pointed out that Bloomberg published an article based on comments made by Scott Bessent, the billionaire hedge fund manager who's the Treasury Secretary. And Bessent said that the U.S. has what Bloomberg reported on. They called it a grand encirclement strategy. And Bessent acknowledged that the U.S. is trying to pressure India, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and also Vietnam. Good luck with that. To ally with the U.S. against China. So Bloomberg is reporting on these comments made by Bessent saying the U.S. is a grand encirclement strategy. And then Hegseth says we don't have an encirclement strategy. I mean, and I pointed out, by the way, in this video that I did, this isn't just the Trump administration. In the Biden administration, Antony Blinken also said, yeah, this is this Bloomberg article. So Bessent says it's a grand encirclement plan. And then Hegseth says we're not trying to encircle China. And I pointed out, yeah, so here's this article in Bloomberg. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India as a grand encirclement strategy. Bessent said we can approach China as a group. So that claim is objectively false. But I pointed out that it's not just the Trump administration. If you go back to the Biden, I mean, of course, if you go back to the Obama administration, but if you go back to the Biden administration, Antony Blinken gave an important speech in 2022 outlining the Biden administration's China policy. It was a very hawkish speech as well, although it wasn't as cartoonishly aggressive as Hegseth. He didn't say we're preparing for war. But, Blinken in his characteristic, liberal interventionist, rules-based international order rhetoric, he said that the U.S. is working to, quote, shape the strategic environment around Beijing, end quote. What does that mean? Shape the strategic environment around China? That means containment. It's just a euphemism for containment. So this has been the U.S. policy under Democrats, and it's, of course, continuing under Republicans because this has been the U.S. strategy. This is the U.S. empire strategy for over a decade.
This is a consistent policy that actually grows larger and larger. And Pete Hegseth says quite explicitly that they want to move. That's what a big part of that speech was, is they want to move the United States' capabilities to the Asia Pacific, and then they want to burden share by essentially increasing the military expenditures of these countries, just like what they did to Ukraine, and create all kinds of militaries, all kinds of armies that the United States can get involved with and encircle China.
Well, absolutely. And we have to remember all of these capabilities Secretary Hegseth is bragging the U.S. is encircling China with across the Asia Pacific region. These were all put in place during the 4 years President Biden was in office, the 4 years before that Trump was in office. And this all began under the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. So people who keep voting, thinking that one candidate from one party or the other is going to change anything. No, because the same list of corporate interests that are funding forums like this are the same ones that control policy in Washington, regardless of who's in the White House or who controls Congress. I want to touch on something that Ben mentioned, the Philippines and this absurd attitude that these officers in the Philippine military have, this servile obedience, this eagerness to throw themselves at the feet of the United States. Philippines, we keep hearing about how China is threatening the Philippines. Philippines was literally a colony of the United States from 1898, when they took over from Spain, to 1946. And they've only had de facto independence since then. The United States has maintained political control over the Philippines ever since, up to and including today. It was like a brief period of time under President Duterte where they were trying to reassert their interests, balance their ties. People don't know this because they don't look into any of this stuff. The Philippines has a much larger population than Thailand. It has a much smaller GDP, and it's specifically because it is being turned into a forward operating base by the United States instead of cooperating with the rest of the region and together with China to rise with everybody else. And when I talk about the colonization of the Philippines, if you go to the State Department's own Office of the Historian website under the Philippine-American War, the United States, they talk about how they were burning entire villages, implementing civilian reconcentration policies, putting them in concentration camps, and employing torture. So nothing under the sun has changed since then up until now. This is how the U.S. has always conducted its business, and this is how it has treated its so-called ally. And that is an example for the entire region to look at. That's what's going to happen to you. Ukraine is what's going to happen to you if you allow yourself to be pulled into America's orbit, not because they're going to help you or offer an alternative. Listen to Secretary Hegseth. He's talking about either security cooperation with us or economic cooperation with China. He didn't say security and economic cooperation with the U.S. The U.S. has no alternative to offer any of these countries or the island province of Taiwan. They are setting it up to be destroyed, just like Ukraine. And in the think tank papers planning all of this out, they admit everything is going to be scoured off the surface of the island. Nothing's going to be left. And the goal here is not to save Taiwan. It's to use it to cost China. And I just want to point out that the U.S. is using proxies like Ukraine against Russia, Taiwan against the rest of China, the Philippines against China, to degrade strategic capabilities so that if there is a direct conflict between the U.S. and either one of these countries, they will be depleted when it happens. That is part of the strategy. This is part of their thought process doing all of this.
I agree strongly with what Brian said. And I'll add, in terms of Philippine domestic politics, let's not forget during the first Cold War, we're now in Cold War II, but during Cold War I, the Philippines was a major U.S. proxy, and it was governed by this brutal military dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., historical deja vu. His son is now the leader of the Philippines again and is this obedient U.S. puppet. And it's not just ideological, but it's also obviously simply corruption. I mean, it's well known that the Marcos family is extremely corrupt. Marcos Sr. and his wife stole billions of dollars, and the U.S. not only tolerated but facilitated that corruption. This is how the U.S. empire works. You know, they facilitate corruption, give all this money to these corrupt oligarchs who govern on their behalf and turn their countries into these like neo-colonial proxies. And in the case of what happened to the previous president, Duterte, who tried to maintain a kind of more non-aligned foreign policy, you know, he still had relations with the U.S. that were decent, but he also significantly improved relations with China. What happened recently, Marcos essentially used the International Criminal Court to imprison his main political opponent. And Marcos, what he did was, honestly, it was in a very Machiavellian way. It was pretty smart. He made a political alignment with Duterte's daughter, who was his vice president, and then he completely betrayed them and used, basically, I mean, in the Philippines, this has been a huge controversy, because what essentially Marcos, with the backing of Washington, is doing is using the ICC as a political tool to eliminate his main domestic political rival. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has an ongoing arrest warrant for crimes against humanity committed in Gaza, he's flying to the U.S. frequently. He's going across European airspace. The Europeans that claim to support the rules-based international order are doing nothing. The Netherlands, where the ICC is located, is doing nothing, making it clear that the ICC is only for people from Africa and Asia, not for Western leaders, and Israel is part of the collective West. So Netanyahu, there's going to be zero consequences for Netanyahu, not to mention Biden and Trump and Obama and Bush, zero consequences for them. But now the U.S., which is not even a member of the ICC, is allowing its proxy in the Philippines to weaponize the ICC to imprison his main political rival, while he continues to destroy his country and turn it into the Ukraine of Asia. I mean, it's outrageous. And the only silver lining in all of this is that if you look at Marcos's opinion ratings, he's one of the least popular leaders in the world. And people in the Philippines obviously are furious about what's going on. But I mean, this is not surprising considering, look at all the U.S. allies around the world. Look how popular Zelensky is. I mean, obviously not popular at all, which is why he had to cancel elections and illegalize most political parties.